The X-Men started in 1963. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the guys who created pretty much everything except Spider-Man back then, came up with their new group. Originally, it was going to be called the Mutants, I think, until Martin Goodman, the publisher, said, "What the hell are mutants?" So they came up with the name the X-Men instead. The original team was Angel, Iceman, a very different Beast, Marvel Girl, and Cyclops, with Professor X running the team. Stan and Jack left the book after about a year and a half. It was replaced by a number of solid but mid-level artists and writers. Steranko did a few issues briefly and kind of highlighted the book, and then Roy Thomas and Neil Adams took over for a great run. I mean, a wonderfully written and wonderfully drawn run. But the book never seemed to be a hit, ever, its entire run. And after about 65, 70 issues, it became a reprint book. They just started reprinting the original stuff. And it was fallow. I mean, the book ran about 20-odd issues as a reprint. Marvel was trying different packages. It wasn't simply giant-sized X-Men #1. There was giant-sized Chillers, giant-sized Werewolf, the single most uncomfortable comic book title in history, giant-sized Man-Thing. They tried a lot of different titles in that particular format, and X-Men was one of them. The book was going to be bi-monthly initially, and double-sized stories, and we wanted to see how it would sell. And before we got to the second issue, they decided to cancel the giant-sized format. And so what was going to be giant-sized X-Men 2 became X-Men 94 and 95.
I had gone over to Marvel and was looking around for work, and they'd given me some odd jobs, and I'd inked some issues of the Avengers and penciled a couple of giant-sized issues, but I wanted something that I could stay on regularly. Roy Thomas was editor-in-chief at the time, and Roy wanted to start it all over again, possibly with new characters. I'd been badgering him for something to do, and he says, "All right, you come in on it as the artist." Roy
Thomas, who was the editor-in-chief of the comics company at that point, kept talking about the possibility of finding a way to revive the X-Men as an international group of heroes. They had a lot of different countries publishing their books, and they thought, well, maybe if we did a book where characters from countries where the books are very successful appeared, we can sell even more copies.
Len Wein was the choice as writer and doing a plotting session. The two of us would kick ideas around, and there was actually some other guys from the Marvel bullpen that sat in on it too, including Chris Claremont, who wound up writing the book later on.
We wanted to put together a new team. You had to do an international team. And Dave had this amazing book of character designs he had done over the years. And we sat down together one day and said, all right, what would make a great team?
Nightcrawler was a character I came up with when I was still in the Navy. And I had an idea for a possible book called The Intruder. Nightcrawler was a demon at the time, and he had screwed up on a mission from hell, and rather than go back and face punishment, he stayed up on the mortal plane, and he was a sidekick to the Intruder. Then, when I was doing the Legion of Superheroes, I proposed Nightcrawler as a Legionnaire. And editor Murray Boltinoff thought he was too funny looking and shot that down. So he wound up being an X-Man. He evolved a little bit along the way, and I dropped the demon aspect of Nightcrawler, but basically it was the same character all along.
Storm was actually a combination of two other characters. They originally had a character called the Black Cat and a character called Tempest, and neither of those characters were gelling. And I think Roy Thomas suggested one day, he said, well, why don't you just make one character out of it? Take his powers and her look and personality and put them together. And we kind of went, duh, and did. And that's how we got Storm.
One caution that Len Wein had was when I gave her the white hair, he was afraid that readers were going to think she was somebody's grandmother. And I said, trust me, nobody's going to think she's a grandmother, you know. Colossus was roughly based on a character that I'd come up with in college that I called Mr. Steel. We had decided that we wanted a Russian character, and so I made this guy a big, burly Russian farm boy, and he transformed into the organic steel, as they called it, and he was bulletproof, and he was, relatively free of physical harm. I mean, he actually jumped out of an airplane one time, and then Storm caught him on the way down. She says, "Are you nuts? What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm not going to be hurt. What is it? Leave me alone." He was a fun character. He was supposed to have been the lead character in the book, and we didn't use him that way. I mean, we put him up front on the covers because he was a great visual, but he wound up getting less development than any of the other characters we had until much later in the series.
We created Thunderbird with the specific purpose of killing him in the end of the second story. It had never been done before. And our theory was, if we can kill off somebody that hopefully characters will have come to like, they'll never know what's coming next in the book. And there's nothing better than keeping your audience off balance. We figured, kill somebody now, and from that point on, every time we threatened a character, they would never know if they would make it or not.
Up to that point, any character with an Indian background had always been put in buckskin, and I was so tired of Indian characters in buckskin, and so I wanted, give him a legitimate superhero costume like the others. And I actually liked him quite a lot, and really regretted that we wound up killing him off. But the reason the actual reason we killed him off was because he was an obnoxious loudmouth, and Wolverine did that better.
Wolverine's one of those bizarre cases. I was doing a book for Marvel called Brother Voodoo, and it was set basically in Haiti and in Jamaica. So I was doing Jamaican and Haitian accents for a lot of the characters. And Roy called me in one day and said, you're doing something I cannot do as a writer. I cannot write accents that save my life. Why don't you come up with a Canadian character? Because I'd love to see how you'd write a Canadian accent. And I said, fine. He said, Wolverine's a great name. And I said, perfect. And I took the name and I did research. Wolverines are short, feisty, really nasty characters with razor-sharp claws that will attack things 10 times their size without hesitation. Don't come near them, don't bother them, they'll kill you. I went, there's a character defined right there. So I took those elements and put them together for the basic personality traits initially of Wolverine. My theory initially was that the claws were in his gloves. The blue cloth was covering essentially adamantium gloves. Adamantium being indestructible, you could put claws in the backs of the glove and not have them rip off every time he used them if the whole glove was made out of metal. And they telescoped. They were, again, a molecule thick in each section, but it's indestructible metal, so it makes no difference how thick it is. And they would collapse back into these compartments in the back of the glove. And it was as much a surprise to me as anybody later on when it turned out, they're part of his body. Who knew? Then I went into John Romita's office. John was the art director at Marvel. And we spent an afternoon designing the costume together. John's final version of the character ended up appearing in the end of Hulk 180. Herb basically redrew that shot because that's the perfect pin-up version of the character.
The reason I didn't like Wolverine in the beginning was because he was a psychotic, and he was totally nuts, and what could you do with him, except make a menace out of him.
He didn't like the character particularly. He hated the mask, that's for sure. When I wanted to bring the character in, he didn't want to. He fought me on it. And I said, what's the problem? He's a cool character. He said, I hate the mask. It's sissy and namby-pamby. It makes him look stupid. I don't want to have to draw that mask all the time. I said, well, do you have anything else in mind? He said, yeah. I said, okay, show me what you have in mind. He said, this. I said, that works. And so that was the costume. I mean, the new headdress that with bigger ears and the lack of whiskers was Dave's redesign of the mask.
I later on came to like Wolverine after I'd left the book the first time, and Chris Claremont and John Byrne developed him a lot more. Once they'd done that kind of work with him, I liked him, still do.
If comic books are teenage fantasy, can you pick a character who's a better role model in this fashion? Takes no shit from anybody, absolutely stands his ground. If you get in his way, nobody bullies him. He's a little guy who can't be bullied. He's Jimmy Cagney and Mickey Rooney with lethal blades on his hands. One of my favorite jobs, among the other editorial duties I had at Marvel, was I was the cover editor. I would sit down with the artists, more often Gil than anybody else, and design all the covers. I loved doing that. I had the same job for a period of time at DC when I was working there. I just liked doing covers. And Gil was a master designer. So he was essentially the lead cover guy. Other books would occasionally have covers by their own artists, but Gil did the bulk of the Marvel covers at that period.
The Giant Size X-Men #1 cover, it was a big thrill for me to do. Gil had been one of my heroes as a young fan, so getting to work over Gil was a big thrill. He penciled the main body of it with all the new X-Men charging out, and I inked it. But then I also added the ghostly heads of the older X-Men on the top of the page because they felt they should be represented there too.
We could think of at least a dozen different examples of that cover being redone, including 3 or 4 times by Marvel itself.
It went on to be an extremely popular cover. It's been recreated in one form or another for the past 30 years. I've done recreations of it myself, and it always sells well.
I was editor-in-chief of Marvel at that time. And while I had been writing 4 books a month previously, I discovered as editor-in-chief I couldn't write more than a book a month. And I had my longest run on the Hulk, and it was one of my favorite characters. And when it came down to keeping the X-Men or keeping the Hulk, I decided to keep with the book I've already been doing and having a good time with. Chris was standing in the wings, almost literally. He was my assistant at that point. And he sat outside my office. When I said, I think I'm going to give up the X-Men, he was there going, me, I'm over here. Just notice me. I'll write it. I'll be glad to write it. And I said, great, give it a shot. Who knew?
In terms of hierarchy, I was the #2 editorial guy at Marvel, young punk that I was. Since my desk was right outside Len's office, and since Len and Dave used to do plotting sessions after work, and since I had no life, I would hang out. Occasionally I would kibitz. I knew what was going on. He asked me, since I'd been hanging around, you want to take a shot at it? And I said yes. And that was that.
Chris Claremont wrote it for 18 years straight, and his input had a lot to do with why it was so popular. It didn't seem to matter if you changed artists, but...
I loved Dave's work. I loved it when it was in the Legion of Superheroes. I saw the stuff he was doing for X-Men. I thought, this is just terrific. Wow.
Chris and I got along pretty well, and we plotted stories by, sitting down and having a bull session. On my later run, Chris and I and editor Louise Simonson would get together for lunch. We'd go plot stories at the Japanese restaurant, and I would be drinking plum wine. And it was kind of fun to, we'd talk about, blowing up the world, or, well, we're killing this guy or killing that guy, and people around us were going, oh, what are these people doing, And
the crucial thing with Dave is how deeply he loved the characters. And I think that passion that we both felt for them, that need in us to make them real, translated through to the audience and built the bridges. It wasn't just a gig, it was a twisted, demented, accursed calling.
I remember one time when I really got stuck on a story and I was having a hard time with it. And it dragged on and it dragged on, and the deadline's approaching, and I finally got it finished at about 4 in the morning. I called Chris on the phone, and he said, yeah, what do you want? Chris, I'm finished. And then I hung up.
One of the reasons I didn't have any problem writing Gene out of the book in '94, even though Len had actually written the scene, was because Dave drew her looking like a Texas Republican. He had, 1975 polyester pantsuit, a little flared waist, and this sort of blue cowboy hat. And you looked at her and you thought, ugh, a little too perfect for me. It's a very Stepford Wives sort of thing, very Brie on Desperate Housewives, but without the fashion sense. 4 issues later, when we brought Charlie back into the book and we did the fight at JFK, we were kicking around and I thought, come on, man, it's 1976. Let's get her hip. Let's get her up to date, And Dave drew her in hot pants and blew her hair out. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, man, she's hot. We've got to keep her around. We've got to make her the character we always wanted her to be. I think Dave and I basically wanted to create characters we liked, people we wanted to know, people who would intrigue us and want to bring us back every month to hang out with them and create stories for them. You need them to be friends. I mean, that's the whole dichotomy. They are feared and hated by the world they're sworn to protect, which is why you have to embrace them.
Well, the first time I left X-Men, I was exhausted. We had gone into X-Men 107, which had 50-some-odd characters in it. We'd introduced the Shi'ar Imperial Guard and the Starjammers, and I was just totally worn out. I had been thinking about letting it go for some time, and John Byrne was standing there and breathing hot breath over my shoulder because he wanted it. I finally, I just had to let go and take a rest for a little while. During that period after that, I went on staff for about 2 years at Marvel. I was designing covers for them and that sort of thing.
John Byrne really took the baton from Dave and just ran with it. And he and Chris Claremont seemed to really click on some of the characters. And I know that he was a real big fan of Wolverine, and so he came to the forefront. He really made Wolverine, I think, the character he is today.
John's background is a lot closer to mine, so a lot of the imagery, a lot of the associations, a lot of the inspirations came from similar places. John's storytelling was spot on. You never got confused by what was happening. I'd come in with like Xeroxes of pages and look what Byrne turned in this week. Oh, get away, leave us alone. No, but Byrne's stuff, look at this stuff. The book was phenomenally lucky. I was phenomenally lucky. Over the course of the 30-odd issues we did together, he got better every issue. I mean, it was like a rising curve.
The Byrne X-Men was wonderful because of the intensity of the characterization, as well as the complexity of the stories. They were long, they involved lots of characters. There was a lot of drama, so it was just brilliant. It sucked you in, it made you happy to be there and not want to leave.
He really paid attention to the personalities of the characters. He made Jean Grey just really a very sensual type character. He's always been known for drawing pretty hot chicks, and he made the X-Men just really a group of characters you want to be part of. And I think that's what every creator wants to do, is really make the world so enticing that as a fan, you want to be one of these characters. You want to live in this world.
John's great talent was in taking the most cruel and decadent concept and giving it a veneer of innocence. His Hellfire Club, when you actually look at the original designs for the Black Queen and the White Queen, they're remarkably respectable. You look at them and you think, why are we so upset? I mean, they're actually covering more skin than 90% of most costumes even then, much less now. It's all the backbrain stuff about what the Hellfire Club represents and what leather corsets and thigh boots and all spike heels represent. But where John nailed it, where he absolutely nailed it, were the expressions. The little twist to Jean's lips. This one character he put in the background, this servant girl, who I took one look at, and her face was just so dead. I've seen it all. I'm behind a mask. And she was so perfect that she became Sage over the next 20 years, because I looked at that image and I thought, I've got to find something to do with that. They became defining icons, not because of what they dressed in, but because of the way John handled their faces. I mean, you looked at Emma, who was essentially Faye Dunaway of those days, and you think, she is so scary. And the funny part was, I looked at her and I thought, this is a mature woman who has conquered her world. And don't ever cross her.
Most fans of Byrne's work go like, wow, the art's spectacular, the detail, but it really was the combination of his work with Chris's words. I mean, it really felt like you were watching this in real time. You didn't feel like you were reading an experience. You were, living that experience.
It was a bit more challenging simply because he lived in Canada. I mean, Dave and I could literally go down the street together and hang out for a couple of hours and block out the issue because we lived in New York. With John, bearing in mind, no internet, no email, I don't even think there was FedEx. Maybe he had DHL. No faxing. I went up to Canada a couple of times to hang with him for a while and we'd plot. But the communication was a little more distant, a little more formal. The X-Men had achieved sufficient measure of success that we were a lot more under the magnifying glass than we had been 2 or 3 years earlier. Everything Dave and I did was pretty much under the radar. Nobody expected us to succeed, therefore nobody cared. It was a bi-monthly. It was negligible in terms of the corporate bottom line. Then we started racking up sales. And then John and I kept racking up bigger sales, and suddenly it was like, let's make this book monthly.
Jim Shooter hired me to come work at Marvel. He hired me away from Warren to come work at Marvel. And I was to get the X-Men after the Phoenix Saga was over. There were a few glitches with the Phoenix Saga that Shooter was a little unhappy with and put me in a little early. So I took over with the Death of Phoenix issue. In fact, it was not the Death of Phoenix until I had taken it over, I'm afraid.
For the most part, Dark Phoenix happened substantially without interference. The basic thrust of the story was John and me sitting in Roger Stern's apartment and putting this thing together, just seeing how far we could go and not be stopped.
So I'm sitting in my office. I know I'm going to get the X-Men eventually. And Chris, as everyone knows, loves to come in and show you the stuff he's working on and tell you the stories of what he's working on. So he comes into my office and he says, look, I got these great X-Men pages, and here they are. And he shows me this panel of Phoenix destroying a sun. And Byrne has drawn the asparagus people screaming as they died. You get this blast effect of the sun going over and the asparagus people going, ah, like that. So I said, Chris, you can't do this. It makes Phoenix a mass murderer. You just can't take a hero and turn him into like this villainous mass murderess. It just isn't gonna work. It's not done. Chris said, it's not a problem. Salicrup showed it to Shooter, and Shooter okayed it. And I said, I'm not the editor. What do I know? 2 months later, maybe, Shooter got the make-readies back on that issue. I don't know whether it just had gone the first time, or I don't know, maybe Salicrup only thought he had seen it. Anyway, he read, 10 million asparagus people screamed as they fried and said, all right, that's it, Salicrup, you're off the book. Wheezy's on. Okay, here's the deal. Phoenix dies or she's in hell forever. So Chris made the choice to kill her, and I think it was one of those choices that made the X-Men, It was the right choice. He loved that character too much to torture her. So death was preferable. And at the time, I don't think either of us thought she would ever come back. We were told by Shooter that she would never, ever, ever come back. And we believed him.
From the Death of Phoenix to, I guess, up to Inferno, the shape of the X-Men were defined by me working in conjunction with Louise Simonson and Ann Nocenti. It was the editor, writer, penciler triangle that was unique. It was the perfect confluence of passion and craft and freedom.
I found the X-Men a very easy book to work on because Chris was a dream to work with. The artists that we had were generally just great. Tom Orzechowski, who lettered the book, never made a mistake. So it was just a dream job. I loved it. I loved working on the X-Men.
You're looking at a sequence of issues that are just phenomenal. It's basically me sitting there and saying, I don't know what to write, and Weezy saying, just asking questions about the characters. And one question would lead to an answer, and an answer would lead to a story. That is a level of editorial expertise and involvement and collegiality, which is rare at the best of times and to a certain extent today, because of the dynamic changes in the industry, almost non-existent.
I had done an X-Men story in Marvel Fanfare, and it was so much fun that I called up Chris and said, listen, if Byrne ever wants to leave, I'd like to have it back. And Byrne left the following Monday. I don't know how that came about, but that put me back on the book.
I was really glad that Dave had the chance to come on and, make the contributions that he did all over again and actually get more heralded for the stuff he had done.
Returning to the X-Men after John Byrne's run was interesting. We got bomb threats and things like that for, how dare you take it away from John Byrne,
The other thing that occurred in the 80s, Frank's Daredevil was our competition for most of that decade until he left. And once he left, that was it. Frank would do a story, and then Weezy and I would sit down and say, let's do something better. Nothing so inspires like heady competition, like looking at someone and saying, God, he's really good. Well, I better be better then.
I had come up with a proposal for my own group, the Futurians, and I was in a plotting session with Chris and Louise Simonson, and I'm telling them about the Futurians and what I wanted to do with it, and I'm jumping up and down and waving my arms and having a good time. And the two of them decided that I was more interested in doing the Futurians than I was in doing the X-Men, and they talked me into quitting. So I went ahead and did the Futurians graphic novel. But they had a kind of a panicky week after that because nobody wanted to do the X-Men, because nobody wanted to have to do that many characters.
I was at a convention recently, and I had several people come up to me and say that Paul Smith's run was their favorite. Paul's work was definitely elegant. He had a sensitivity of line, and for making line, make the characters come alive and the story come alive. His storytelling was great too. He was really good at taking Chris's extremely complex, very detailed plots and breaking them down into a very comprehensive 22 pages. But he had been an animator, and I think that that's maybe where his storytelling talents evolved, maybe, or he honed them.
You loved his characters. You just looked at them and you thought, oh God, I want to take them home. I want those women. I want to be that guy. In the Mariko wedding issue, we've just come off of the Wolverine miniseries. Wolverine's engaged to his true love in Japan. And we've just introduced Rogue. The basic instruction to Paul was, she walks in the door, we have to fall in love with her, right off the bat. If we don't look at this woman and immediately want to hug her, then we've lost, because then there's no point in keeping her around. And the son of a bitch nailed it. That one shot of her on page 2, of just standing there, so polite and so vulnerable. And it was just, you look at that and you think, oh, yes, she wins him over. And that's the foundation. The whole idea with Paul was he took them and he made them ideals in the best sense of the word. The whole essence of the X-Men for me is that these are people you want to know. These are people you want to be with. These are people you want to root for. You always had the sense that Paul's X-Men would be friends.
My first book at Marvel was Alpha Flight, and which is really cool because of a connection to the X-Men, because they had first showed up in X-Men. John Byrne created Alpha Flight, so I was really excited about that. And then, sure enough, my very first issue of Alpha Flight was an all-new Alpha Flight team, all these characters I didn't recognize. But I think in the second or third issue of that run, they did flashbacks to Wolverine, and so like, oh my God, I can just draw Wolverine. And so yeah, I probably labored like 2 or 3 hours on this tiny little figure in the background of Wolverine. That was a lot of fun. Any fan getting into a business, when you're talking to people that you idolized as a kid, I mean, it's just a nerve-wracking experience. So, you're calling, you're quivering, and you're like, hey, Mr. Claremont, or can I call you Chris? Christopher? What do you like? And I honestly don't remember too much about that very first conversation. I was just asking him questions, just trying to like keep him on the phone, see how long I can keep him on the phone for, and I can tell people, hey, I talked for 10 minutes to Chris Claremont, that kind of thing. And but that was, we got over it fairly soon. I think once you get behind the door, behind the curtain, and you sort of see how comics are made and how different it is from what you expect, your expectations of what it is, it relaxes you because you realize it's a pretty informal environment, it's a pretty casual environment, it's a very creative environment. So, I think after that first conversation, things really clicked. If you look at what I kind of contributed, most of it was the stuff I loved as a kid. Stuff with Sentinels, stuff in the Savage Land. As a fan, when you become a pro, you want to redraw this stuff, but with your take on the same kinds of environments, same kind of villains. Just had a checklist of these are all-time great stories of X-Men. We never made it to Arcade, but I would have loved to have done that too.
People were coming into the business who read my stuff when they were kids. Jim Lee, at the beginning, he wanted to do the books he remembered from when he read my stuff with John. And my problem was, dude, I did that 10 years ago. I want to do something different. I want to move it on to a different place.
I think that accounted for a lot of our successes, that the enthusiasm I brought to the book was from a fan. I think Chris had been working on the book maybe 14 or 15 years at that point. And when you're working with characters for that long, the kinds of things you want to do with the characters is not necessarily the kinds of things that fans would want to see. Chris had already written several Sentinel arcs, many Savage Land stories. It's like, why would I want to go back and do that? Like, I want to do them trying on new costumes or going to college or that kind of thing. And because I was coming from this experience where I was just this hardcore fan, getting in the book, the stuff that I wanted to do was what the fans wanted to see, I think. I think there was a real good dynamic there, because Chris obviously wanted to keep evolving the characters and developing their personalities and sort of their life arcs, and I wanted to go back in and take these characters to places where they shine the best.
Terry Stewart comes in as publisher. First thing he does, Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man. And it sells 2 million copies. Next spring, Rob Liefeld's X-Force sells 4 million copies. Then we come along 4 months later and we sell 8.
Big selling comic book today is like 200,000 copies. I think we sold about 8 million copies of X-Men #1 back in '91. It was best-selling comic still to this day. We had 5 covers that helped. I've met so many kids today that go, that was the first comic book I ever bought, which instantly is a great honor, but also instantly makes you feel very, very old, because they're like 25 now, and like, what? How old were you when you bought this? 2? 5? What? That was a great, fun issue to do. In fact, I was terrified during that whole time I was working on that I was going to break my hand and I wouldn't be able to do this new first issue. And so I'd drive through intersections with my hand, I kind of, I was always worried a car would hit me and cripple my drawing hand. Something that Chris Claremont set up, having Wolverine with Jubilee and Psylocke, was just a great sort of trio, because I think Wolverine, just by himself, he's just a little too rough. Jubilee brings out the humanity in him. And I think Chris realized early on, Jubilee is like his Robin, to the point where, he asked me, design a costume that's reminiscent of Robin to really drive home the point that Jubilee is his sidekick. And then Psylocke was just sort of this new toy that he got to play with. You know, she brought a sexiness to the trio that Wolverine obviously lacks. And she was the stoic one, he was the gruff one, and she was comedy relief. He really set up some very strong dynamics between the three characters that probably persist to this day. One of my favorite characters of all time has always been Cyclops. He always kind of got the shaft, I always felt, during the run, and certainly was not probably one of Chris's favorite characters to lead the team because he was probably so vanilla, so white bread, but I always thought he was just a great character. When we did the new X-Men, you can tell who all my favorite characters were because Wilson and I came with the idea of these two different strike forces that one would stay home and one would be the away team, and we picked teams, you know. So all the characters I had on my team were the ones that I liked. I wanted to do an arcade. I just love that character. I know he's lame, but I love the huge pinball and being shot up into it is just so over the top and ridiculousness, but I thought I could have done some really cool stuff. The X-Men were unique in that they had all these associations with fantasy worlds and magic and science fiction, and sometimes you can kind of stray from that core message, which is, you know, all about tolerance and trying to basically save a world from people that hate you, right? And we try to really get back to that as much as possible.
I believe I was the first writer who was not named Chris Claremont to have his name in the credits of Uncanny X-Men in 17 years. And it was just a joy to get to take over a book that was that important.
Chris had just left after a 17-year run, and there was some deadline problems. And the editor had come up to me and pulled me into the office and handed me 22 pages of penciled artwork and said, "You have 2 days to do 22 pages. Can you do it?" And I said, "Yeah." And inside I was like, what I found out years later was that they had pretty much gone through every name in the Rolodex. I mean, they were probably calling up people from DC, they were probably calling, you know, the Archie guys, they pretty much anybody that would pick up the phone. And essentially everybody that they had gone to had turned down the assignment. And the reason why several people gave was that after 17 years of Chris's run on the book, they didn't want to be the one to ruin the X-Men. And so the assumption was, you know, they'd kind of, after they'd gone through every list, they talked about it. And the assumption was, well, we'll give it to Scott. We'll let Scott ruin it. And then anybody else will pick up the phone and go, yeah, I'll come in and save the X-Men. That'll be a great job. So unfortunately, I tricked them all by, I guess, doing a good enough job to keep, to stay hired. And then I eventually inherited the book after several months of, filling in.
We kind of got thrown to the wolves in a lot of ways. We didn't have a lot of time to plan or prepare. We didn't have a lot of opportunity to sit down and lay out our story ideas of how we wanted to go and where we wanted to go. We knew that there was already in place a summer crossover event that had to happen because it had already been decided in the budget that it was going to happen. 4 titles, 3 issues each, and we had to come up with that within a couple issues of our starting the books. So that was Executioner's Song. I did most of the grunt work in terms of breaking down the whole story. I just worked on a grid box, and I made 12 boxes out and wrote in real rough beats for each issue. And then that was what we presented to the writers, Scott, myself, Peter David, Larry Hahn, I think, was writing Wolverine at the time. And we all got together for the first of our, what turned out to be many story conferences, to hammer out Executioner's Song.
I was working at DC for a while, and then I got a call from Bob Harris to do some work up at the X office. And I did a couple fill-ins. I think my first thing was an issue of X Factor that Louise Simonson wrote. And from there, it just steamrollered, and I did a couple fill-ins on Uncanny X-Men when Jim Lee was on there. After Jim left the X-Men, Bob asked me if I wanted to take it over. And I said, sure.
It wasn't an editorial dictate by any means. The editor didn't say, draw like this. The editor would say, just like Stan Lee used to do with plenty of artists when he was showing them Jack Kirby's work, he wasn't saying draw like Jack Kirby, he was saying draw with the kind of power and energy and style that Jack Kirby employs on his pages. Well, Bob Harris would do the same thing with the artists he was using. Don't draw like Jim Lee, but look at what Jim does that brings power to a page, that draws your eye to a certain panel or a certain figure. At the time, it was a very, very popular approach to the work. We called it the posing art style, which is not necessarily a balanced flow in terms of your panel-to-panel storytelling. Your page was really nothing more often than a setup for your big, beautiful panel. So you'd have a couple inset panels that crammed way too much information in there, and then you'd have your big dynamic panel that would make all the 14-year-old kids go, ooh, ah,
I love Jim's artwork, and I first noticed it when he was drawing Punisher War Journal. And it was really the first time I would really go out to a comic shop to buy somebody's artwork on a regular basis. And I started collecting it, and of course, he influenced me. And so, through his X-Men stuff, he influenced me too.
I love Andy. I think Andy's a phenomenal artist. I think, like all of us, we got thrown into a pressure cooker. His brother, Adam, had the cakewalk because he got to draw Wolverine. And Andy would always say, I wish I could just be drawing Wolverine. And I understood that completely.
It's a lot of work. I enjoy drawing a team book. You have to draw everything on a 10 by 15 sheet of paper anyway, so everything's got to fit on there. Whether you're drawing one character or a bunch of characters, to me, it's really pretty close to be about the same amount of work.
The book never sold as much as it did during that time period, and never has. Never did before, never has since.
The character that I am most intrigued by is Professor X, and I think that the X-Men have always worked best with Professor X at the center of it. And you had, Professor X on one side and, Magneto on the other. X-Men writers had kind of come to the conclusion that, in a way, Professor Xavier was Martin Luther King and Magneto was Malcolm X. The idea of bringing equal rights to mutants and stuff. There was a time when that seemed to be right. I think that what we lost along the way was that no, actually, Magneto was like Hitler. Magneto was a character that was willing to settle for nothing less than the destruction of the human race or the domination of the human race. He had become what he most hated. He had spent time in a concentration camp where he was the minority that had genocide raining down upon it. And all these years later, he grew up into a man who's was essentially, became everything that he hated. And I think that in some ways there have been probably stories over the years that in an effort to kind of humanize him may have pulled him away from why he was such a strong character in the first place.
We were in a meeting, all the writers were there, and we were trying to come up with the climax to X-Men 25 and make it a big, bold, dramatic thing. This was all about Magneto's buttons getting pushed. He was up in space and he was getting people to come to him like a sanctuary. Come to me and I'll save you from the madness down there. I'm not pushing their buttons, I'm not instigating them, I'm just creating a haven for you. And within that context, he found out that the government had created something called the Magneto Protocols, which would basically prevent him from ever being able to come back down to Earth again. So he destroyed the satellites that were going to do that. And in doing so, created devastation on a brief but very furious level all across the world. The X-Men had to retaliate for his actions, which were actually a retaliation against the human government's actions. So a lot of people actually say that Magneto was out of character and all that, and my response is only in all the other chapters. In any chapter I wrote, he was perfectly in character. He was being instigated. So we needed to come up with the climax. What's the big moment? We knew that Magneto was confronting Wolverine in this climax, and Peter David just shouted out, "Why doesn't he just finally rip his skeleton out?" And everyone just froze for a second. And we all just looked at each other, and then we looked at Peter, and Peter said, "I'm just kidding, I was only kidding." And we said, "No, that's it. Well, that's it. We know that's it." So we knew that it would be a big, big moment. We knew that the fans would go nuts. We knew that every fan would think that he'd have it back in 3 issues, so that when it didn't happen again, a lot of people were very surprised by that. And it paid off. It was a really, really exciting payoff.
For almost the entire run of Wolverine, I think it was maybe 3+ years, he didn't have his adamantium. So it was, it's like it's Wolverine, but it's like not really Wolverine. It was an interesting time to be on him because he was really put through the paces and he experienced things that I don't think the character had experienced before. And I could give my particular take on it because he hadn't been that way. Richard Eisenoff started coloring for Marvel, and we worked together on the X-Men, and that was really after about a couple of years of computer coloring. And he did things that were just unbelievable, and I think that made the all the difference for me as far as my artwork, because there's all of a sudden you're basically doing full color painted work, and here's a colorist that you can depend on to take your work up 1, 2, 3 levels, and having that kind of comfort level while you're drawing means everything as an artist. Inking is done digitally, along with the tried and true method of just putting ink over the pencils and erasing the pencils. A lot of artists are experimenting with drawing their pages very tight in pencil, and then basically it gets darkened on the computer and the digital inker will clean everything up and make it cleaner.
Richard Eisenoff is a genius. He really, really is. He's developed so many techniques on a computer with the Photoshop and stuff, and he's classically trained in illustration, which I am too. And that's why we kind of mesh really well. What I would give Richard was not flat blacks. I would give him pencil shading. All the lines, all my shading lines would go in the same direction through the whole thing. And through contrast and light, I would try to direct your eye where I wanted you to go to see. I would scan into pages once I was done with them, send them off to Richard, and he would work his magic, He got all those textures, those canvas textures, the spatter textures, and he just adds so much to what you're doing. And it's like he can read your mind as to what you're looking for in color. Mm-hmm.
You get it back and it's like, wow, that's really good, that looks great, And he, he's French, and he goes, oh, yeah, that's nothing. I just, it's like, okay,
Marvel asked me to write Ultimate X-Men back in about 2000, summer 2000s, and I told them that I'm probably the last guy you should get to do this because I didn't grow up reading X-Men, and they said, no, that's good because what will make this easy for modern audiences, mainstream audiences to understand is the fact that you aren't bogged down by all the continuity of the last generation or two. So just go and see the movie and then write stories based on the movie. And it was actually very liberating because normally when you take over a comic book, you've got 40 years of continuity to consider, whereas I was given this nice clean canvas just to go where I wanted with the characters.
I introduced Mark Millar to the mix, who writes great team books and is just one of the best plotters in comics. And I think the introduction of Mark was the perfect injection of life that the book needed because, Mark, being from Scotland, he has a much more international view of the world. That point of view that Mark brought to the book was very, very important because it does have sort of an international flavor to it.
The X-Men movie was really the fundamental behind Ultimate X-Men. It was very, very important that the kind of people who would go and see the movie, they had to somehow bring all those people into comics. So the X-Men movie really was the starting point for virtually everything I did with my time on the X-Men. And if I was referencing anything, I really had to try and reference that movie as much as possible. We even changed the costumes to look more like the movie costumes, drew the characters characters to look like the movie characters.
It was a little confusing how I should handle Wolverine in Ultimate X-Men. Do I draw him tall or short? So I kind of did it halfway, you know. I didn't draw him like 6 foot tall, but I didn't draw him like a, you know, like a fire plug.
After I'd been writing it for maybe around a year or so, I became so intrigued with the characters that just I had to eventually go back and take a look at what other people had done with them. And I think that definitely shaped and influenced my stories after that. But there was a lot of great material that I'd missed, and it was quite exciting, you know, just be able to read it all at once. It was a bit like kind of suddenly discovering Francis Coppola and Steven Spielberg and having Jaws and The Godfather and everything to watch over a few nights. It was great. Adam and I just, we worked together on this thing for 2 to 3 years, and we just eventually developed some kind of like telepathic code. You know, I got to the point where I almost didn't need to write anything down anymore. You know, I would just do the minimum of words, and Adam just got exactly where I was coming from. So it was kind of like sad ending the book because it was a nice collaboration. It worked out really well.
Well, we never spoke over the phone because I couldn't understand a word he was saying. You know? It was all through emails. But he wrote very cinematically. That was the big difference. Everything that is good in a good movie is what Mark pulled through in his scripts. The characterizations were spot on. They were his interpretations. So I took his lead and did my interpretations of these characters.
For me, I write backwards. I start every story at the end and then work my way back, which is probably insane, you know, but I don't know if anyone else does this, but I just like to know my last page and then work back from there, just so that I don't feel like I've run out of space whenever I get to the end, and people hopefully feel the endings are satisfying. If I'm going to cram everything in, I'll cram it in at the start.
A good comic book, it's like you're watching a movie or reading a novel. It's the combination of the two. You know, it's interesting, it's fun, and it's rewarding, and getting in that zone, sitting behind your board, nobody else is around, and you're smiling as the characters smile, or gritting your teeth as the characters grit their teeth. I mean, you should see my dad. He's like, you know, when he's drawing his books, you know, is he gritting, or is he's not sweating?
He's happy.
He's happy.
He's very happy.
You know, he's like, I would be
he's
happy.
in his own little world, and he doesn't have to deal with the day-to-day things that are going on.
Yeah, I would be happy too
He
if I drew
escapes.
that well.
Yeah,
know?
me too.
The Kubert brothers are pretty much the kind of Marvel royal family. They've both worked for Marvel Comics for like the last 15 years as their top artists, but their dad, as it turns out, was one of the most famous artists of his generation too, and there's this lovely lineage. And I like the idea of having all the Kuberts all working on this book, because they are all hugely respected, they're all great at what they do, and it was nice, and they were really happy about it too, because it was the first time I think they'd all worked together.
I love giving my work to my dad, and what I get back is just, you know, it's just beautiful, gorgeous work. The sequence itself was a Gulf War sequence. It lent itself to my dad's work, to the Army stuff, to Sergeant Rock, and that was a flashback sequence. I could have done looser pencils, but I like doing them tight. He says, "What are you putting so much into it for?" Because I want a little bit of me in there, Dad, you know?
I wanted to bring a new voice, sort of find somebody out there who was going to have sort of the same kind of vision that a guy like Chris would have. And Grant Morrison was just sort of chock full of ideas that took us to sort of the next evolution of X-Men.
Grant came in 3 years ago to substantially revamp the way that people look at the X-Men. New uniforms, new look, new ethos, new reality. Mutants were not a painfully small minority of the Marvel Universe. There were millions of them. They were in sufficient numbers that they could have communities, a force unto themselves. Indeed, the big revelation, humanity itself is extinct in all but name. Mutants have won. The war is over.
Because of all those years of continuity, the stories that were being written and created were really sort of hinged upon continuity. And Grant came in with this sort of fresh perspective that was really wonderful for the books. I'd found out that Grant was leaving X-Men literally at the 11th hour. I was dumbfounded. I had no idea who could take over his position. All of a sudden I find myself at San Diego Convention, which is the biggest convention in America, and I was doing a small signing at this small booth, and it was a nonstop reel in my head. Who's going to replace Grant? And all of a sudden I'm like, Joss Whedon. I'm like, boy, that's a long shot. And so help me God, I look up from the table, and standing right in front of me is Joss Whedon. He's like, hey man, haven't seen you in a long time. It was unbelievable. It was just one of those great moments, you know? So I closed my eyes and then I wished for Pam Anderson, but she didn't show up. So I grabbed him by the arm, and I literally walked him behind this little booth, and I said, I don't know if you've heard, but Grant is leaving X-Men. He's like, wow, those are really big shoes to fill, man. I don't know if I can do that. And I said, Joss, just think about it. He's like, well, you know, it's good timing right now. I'm in between projects and da-da-da. So I thought he was going to say no. But then we exchanged numbers and so on. And then I remember I went on vacation and I was on a cruise ship, and I was trying to get internet on the cruise ship and finally figured out how to do it and started emailing Joss back and forth, and he was vacillating back and forth. And then eventually when we got John, who was somebody he really wanted to work with, that was sort of the missing piece to the puzzle.
Joss had been a fan of Planetary, another book that I do, and had even written an introduction for one of our collections. We got to know each other. I would take trips out to California, and I would see him then. We got to be friends. I visited the set of Firefly when he was doing the show. He was actually doing, at the time, it was the last season of Buffy, Angel was still going, and he was doing Firefly. He was doing 3 shows. He says, John, I need you to come by. Let's go have dinner, and I have an offer you can't refuse. The thoughts were running through my head of what's going on, what's happening. And he talked to me and he said, Joss is in, we're going to do X-Men. We want you to come and join our party.
The other part of it is he delivered in spades. It's one thing to have a big name creator come after another huge creator who's had a huge influence, but now you got this guy who's bombarded the X-Men with even more ideas. It's been a pretty banner 4 years for X-Men fans in that sense, to have 2 legendary guys like that come in and influence your books.
Joss is different because, for one thing, he's a director as well. I don't think he ever set out to just be a writer. One of the reasons I believe he broke into TV was because he wanted to direct what he's doing. He wanted to do it all. You look at his writing, whether it's TV or film or comics, he's very visual. The minute I read it, lightning goes to my brain, and I know what the image is. I can thumbnail almost as I read when I go through his scripts. I care about these characters, and I know Joss does. And with my designs and the way I treat them as actors. I try to get inside them as much as Joss does. And Joss writes them so beautifully, and they're exactly what I would want them to be. There's not another soul on earth who could write these characters the way he does for me. They hadn't been in costume in a while, and we wanted to shake things up, and it's hard to do that when you're status quo. I look at someone like Cyclops, and I don't see him having the big gelled moosed hair and everything. But look, that works for its time, and it is what it is, but I see him like he was originally. I see him as this man with not a great deal of emotion, who's closed up inside, and his personality comes out in his costume. The only expression you're getting from him is this glowing red line going across his face. The simplicity of that is so perfect for him, and it tells you a lot about his character. The Beast, had been covered up, and in a very stylish, great way. I like what the guys had done before us, but I got a guy covered in blue hair. I'm going to show that. We're going to see that. I'm going to take his shoes off because he uses his feet. A great fear of his is that he doesn't actually know what he's turning into. We say that he believes he's turning into a cat, and he does. He is clearly turning into a cat, but there's bits of him that I try to put in where you're not quite sure if that's the direction he's going in or not. Sometimes his nose might look a bit different. It's not quite a cat. Is it more pig-like? Is it more dog-like? You know, and his greatest fear is that there's a bigger mystery at hand than even he knows. The number 3 cover was the Beast. And there's a framed photo of the Beast, the way he used to be back in the original team. No fur. He was a guy, he had big, big Kirby hands and feet and all that, but he was still very much human. And it's been shattered. And his furry claw is holding it. The furry claw that is no longer a hand. And that's it. We don't see his face. We just see that. It's a very quiet moment. It's a moment only for him. And that scene never happens in the book, in the story. It never happens. And it's something I take from artists like N.C. Wyeth, people who illustrated books, back in, earlier in the century, is that the best ones wouldn't just illustrate what was written to them, what was in, what wasn't written on the page. They would take something that was hinted at, and they would show you that to give you some sort of backstory. Not a detailed backstory, but just a glimpse, a character glimpse, a quiet moment. And that's one of those covers that I'm proudest of, because we got to say something about this character that goes beyond words, it goes beyond scenes. This is who he is. This is a moment he wouldn't want you to see.
House of M shifted things around in reality and gave so many people their wildest dreams. Wanda, the Scarlet Witch, she has been slowly but surely going insane, and she has this chaos power where she can alter time and space. And in House of M, she creates a world in which Magneto is the ruler of the world, and basically he's gotten his wish. Wanda then eventually finds out that she's been betrayed by her fellow mutants and her family, and basically utters a few very simple words, which are no more mutants. And when we come out of her particular fantasy world, we are now in a Marvel universe where 90% of the mutants, they're basically powerless. They've lost all their mutant powers. One of the reasons I wanted to get there was because I personally felt, when I was a fan reading the books, that there were just way too many mutants. For the core metaphor behind the books, which is basically they're supposed to be the minority, the downtrodden, everywhere you turned, there was a new mutant. Not only that, we actually had a mutant nation with over 6 million mutants called Genosha. Although there were great ideas at the time, I think they were playing in direct opposition to the metaphor. So we wanted to get to sort of this ground zero kind of area where there are only between 200 to 300 mutants left on planet Earth. If we were looking at the Marvel Universe over the next 2 years as a 3-act story, House of M is really sort of the first act. We have Decimation, and Decimation is where we struggle with the idea of how few mutants there are. We have a new Sentinel program that arises from this. We have a whole new status quo in the superhero community. The people that hated mutants, the people that wanted mutants all dead and all gone, but were afraid to go to war against mutants because there were literally millions of them. How did they react now that they know there's only 300 of them? What do they do? We want to get back that sort of that edginess and sort of mistrust between mutants and humans, and just get that edge going again in the Marvel Universe, because I really think that's the way that this universe functions at its best. It has to mirror the outside world. So there'll become a very, very big question that we will be asking, even fans to try to answer within the context of the Marvel Universe, which mirrors the real world. What's more important to you? Is it your own safety or your civil liberties? And that'll be something that'll be carried through for the next year in the Marvel Universe.
X-Men was a lot of fun. As I used to say, working for Marvel and drawing the X-Men was the most fun a boy could have with his clothes on. And
I'm unabashedly proud of my involvement in comic books at a time when, we were driving people into the stores.
At the time, I was just crazy about these characters, and it's something you really don't want to admit too much to people because they look at you funny. But I had so many stories that I was creating as a kid, just drawing them and just thinking about these characters constantly, that when I got onto the book, it felt like I'd already been working on the book for like 10 years.
I was so in love with the work, and they were so passionate and dedicated to it, it came across to the readership. And I like to hope that's part of what happened with the X-Men.
The readers want to spend time with these characters. The villains, the heroes, they're just so interesting that they're willing to spend their time and spend their money to be with them.
Doing the X-Men is a path to fame and glory, really. And everybody that's done it has done well and become big fan favorites.
The wheel has turned and turned and turned, and it's like generations have come up. And every so often you get the opportunity to work with an artist whose work makes you just go, wow, this is rich. This is fun. I want to see what happens next. I like these characters. All you really want then is to tell their stories as strongly and powerfully and evocatively and empathetically as you can, to draw the reader in and hold them there and not let them go, which is what Stan did to me when I was a kid.